Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me today for this webinar. My name is Rachel Clements, and I'm a Regulatory Manager in the Thematic team at the SRA. And I'll be discussing some of the key findings from our Cybercrime Thematic Review, which was published earlier this month. This is an opportunity for you to hear about the experiences of firms we met to gain some further insight into a threat that we all face, and also to learn how you can help to keep your clients and firms safe. There isn't a time for a Q&A, unfortunately, at the end of this session, but if you do have any questions or comments, you can post them in the comments section, and I will try to respond to them afterwards. So firstly, as I know many of you like to know how we choose the firms we see in our sample, in this case, they were chosen from the 458 cybercrime reports we received between 2016 and 2019. We selected a random sample of 40 of those firms, and they were of various sizes and structures, and we went to visit them across England and Wales in 2019. We wanted to learn what types of attacks they were exposed to, what, if anything, they had learned in order to prevent future attacks, and how the attack had affected them. But first, to get you in the cybersecurity mood, while the review of course looks back to last year, here's a quick fire question for you about the current risks this year and the state of play. So think for a moment, or leave a comment if you like, as to whether you think the answer is A, B, C or D. And the question is, how much client money did firms report have been stolen in the first half of 2020? Was it A, £591,644? B, £982,781, C, 1.8 million, or D, 2.5 million? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Well done to those got it right. Yes, the answer is D, £2.5 million, and that's just the first half of this year. And while we know there's an underreporting of cybercrime attacks, this is more than 3 times the amount stolen in the first half of 2019. We also know that from the NCSC that reports about cybercrime has increased by 300%. As more of us working remotely and carrying out our business activities online, it's more important than ever to start thinking about your own cybersecurity. So with that in mind, let's look at what other firms did and what we found. So what did we find out about the types of attacks that firms commonly face? Now, it might not be a surprise to learn that actually email modification fraud was the most common type of cyber attack experienced by firms. It opens the door, of course, to other attacks, for example, phishing, where fraudsters can obtain money or sensitive information like passwords. In fact, 68% of all reported incidents to us involve email modification. Something to bear in mind is that many attacks were actually very sophisticated, involving almost imperceptible changes to names or addresses, most memorably changing an O to a 0 in a firm's name, and many involved email forwarders being used to monitor and intercept emails between firms and clients. Targets also included clients, of course, and key roles such as administrative staff and conveyancers. Other attacks were fairly crude and opportunist, particularly with ransomware, but we saw time and time again that work and personal pressures meant that firms and clients missed the signs of an attack. Other attacks that we saw included denial of service attacks, CEO fraud, 3 ransomware attacks, which accounted actually for some of the most significant disruption at firms. Yes, conveyancing is still a key target, but please don't be complacent because there were other attacks too, including we saw negligence claims, probate and litigation also featuring in our study, and of course to also target settlement money and deposits. Overwhelmingly though, when asked, most firms said to us that the attack had occurred as a result of human error, for example by staff clicking on attachments or responding to fake bogus emails. So even if you're feeling confident about your IT security, do you also feel confident about how a colleague who is at home perhaps right now and facing a security challenge and feeling under pressure, will they make the right decision? But before you all leave to check, on the flip side, how can you also help your firm learn from mistakes when attacks do happen? So let's look at a real example of one such incident experienced by a firm that we visited. So this is case studies about a phishing attack, and this is where fraudsters actually call the victim, and they're often used in combination with phishing emails. In our case study, the firm we met had been carrying out conveyance on behalf of Mr. X and made a bank transfer of £82,000 to complete the transaction. Moments later, their accounts department received a call, purportedly from the bank's security centre, explaining there was an error on the system. And how much had been transferred? The firm confirmed that it was 82,000. Ah, said the caller, because unfortunately there's an error on the system. I'll have to put a stop on the account for 7 days. Unless, of course, I conduct some security checks. Now, the firm didn't want to hold up the transaction, but also wanted to check that they were genuine and asked them to call back so they could verify where they were calling from. They did, and the number that appeared on the telephone dial was the same as the bank's. So, reassured, the firm agreed to help with checks to test the system was working, and so now began the scam. The firm was instructed to try the payment again, but this time to a new account number. They did, and the caller said again, no, that hadn't worked either. Could they try an alternative account and try again? This was repeated over and over again to various account numbers and in various amounts until 25 payments had been made by the firm over the course of an hour. By the time the firm became suspicious and phoned the real bank immediately, £1.2 million, as you can see, was transferred to the fraudster. Now, you might be thinking that this is quite extreme, but this seemingly simple ruse worked by clever social engineering, gaining trust followed by exerting just the right amount of pressure. It sounded credible because the caller had fished the details they needed beforehand. So what was the impact? Well, the firm correctly self-reported the shortage, and with any reports that we receive about cybercrime, we always take a proportionate view. We were satisfied that this was a mistake. However, the firm were, of course, responsible for a £1.2 million shortage, leaving a hefty dent in the client account, and were unable to cover the loss. We carried out a forensic investigation at the firm and engaged constructively, and eventually their insurance claim was successful and the funds were replaced. But I think the key point in this example is that cybercrime is not just about our technological vulnerability, it's also about our vulnerability as users, which can be readily exploited by criminals. An effective cybersecurity system, therefore, must take into consideration both the behaviour of your staff as well as your technological defences. So moving on now to look at the impact of cybercrime more generally, our review revealed significant and long-lasting effects. In some cases, it was a chance actually for positive reflection and positive change, but the immediate aftermath of a successful attack was always expensive and time-consuming in most cases. Some points to highlight. Confidential data, of course, was at risk in every case, but the headline figures were that £4 million were stolen from just 23 of the firms we saw. 3.6 million was actually replaced with insurance policies, but that means a further 400,000 had to be repaid directly from the firms in total. And of course, this isn't the only financial consequence. Costs included for the firms, time taken to deal with the incident both for them and for their IT support, repair and upgrade systems, paying the excess on insurance claims, higher insurance premiums, and so on. But cybercrime is not just about money and data. There is also a personal cost to both clients and firms, and it's something that I think that we don't always think about. Clients were obviously understandably distressed, and firms in their part suffered reputational damage when attacks were reported in the press. Others talked to us about an emotional impact, for example, because they were overwhelmed or because they had feelings of responsibility for an attack. And I think we saw the effects most clearly with two firms who had dismissed their employees and another employee who'd left the firm shortly after an attack. This did actually leave us to have some concerns that some firms might not be fostering a supportive, no-blame culture at their firms. It's worth bearing in mind that a punitive response by a firm might undermine staff's willingness to identify and report future risks to you. So we know, looking at this slide, that the impact was significant for both clients and firms. But how did firms mitigate the effects of an attack? We looked at three key areas: policies, controls and processes in our report, to understand what firms had learned and how prepared they were to face the next attack. So firstly, looking at policies and processes, we looked at measures that outlined a firm's expectations about cybersecurity and how this was physically implemented. Now, we were actually really pleased to see that in terms of good practice, most firms responded positively to cyber attacks, for example, by reviewing their existing policies or introducing new ones. Some training programs provided by firms were impressively tailored and extensive. In particular, policies and procedures to control client-based risks were generally very strong. For example, telling clients that bank details won't change, not providing them by email, reminding clients even about using social media when they're moving house. We also noticed that the small number of firms that had taken the relatively low-cost measure of Cyber Essentials accreditation were the best equipped overall to mitigate future risks. A few firms that we saw even had a specific budget, which allowed them to regularly upgrade systems and have contingency for cybersecurity. Again, it's up to you as a firm to determine whether that would be useful for you, but it does at least provide a cushion should the worst happen to your systems. So now turning to poor practice, and of course what we can learn from it. The firms we met had already experienced costly and time-consuming consequences, but unfortunately not all had taken this as a cue to prepare and plan for future attacks. Over half the firms didn't keep any records of attacks. Now this is a fundamental way to help you understand the specific risks facing your firm and to help you detect and recognise future cyber incidents. 20% have never provided any cyber training at all, a really simple and key way to support staff, which is often freely available online or from your bank. Ultimately, most of the poor practice that we saw amounted to failing to prepare for attacks. And this was shown most acutely by one firm that discovered that professional indemnity insurance did not cover client losses resulting from cybercrime. And another firm in our sample was still in dispute with their insurance provider several months later about coverage for cybercrime losses. And finally, something that led to other risk as well, and we don't always think about it, is that 20% of our firms didn't have any written policies on removable media. This is an example of removable media. As you can see, it's quite small. It's a memory stick and a portable storage device, of course. It's in fact not much bigger than this slightly grubby eraser. But why it's important is that it can expose firms to risks, including importing viruses to systems and, of course, compromising sensitive information because they are small and easily lost or stolen. So moving on to the controls that firms had, this is looking at any measure that would physically prevent the incident reoccurring, for example, IT systems and passwords. Now, cybercrime and cybersecurity, in fact, are always evolving, and hackers look for opportunities to exploit weaknesses in IT systems to gain access. Most firms we saw had good systems and controls again, for example, using passwords that were changed regularly, two-factor authentication for additional security. And most FIAs at firms knew who to report a cyber concern to and felt confident about approaching IT providers to ask a question. But we also, of course, found poor controls. And as we look at the next slide, I want you to think about your own firm or even your own home. Is it a fortress against cybercrime, or do you have an open gate somewhere for hackers to enter? So were other firms a fortress? No, not always. There were gaps in some key areas which suggest some firms might be complacent about the risks, even after an attack. Some key things to mention to you are further concerns about these. Yeah, the data stick again, because some firms allowed staff to bring in their own data sticks from home or use data sticks from clients and estate agents, again exposing them and their clients to further risks. Additionally, 47% of firms didn't have an inventory that would enable them to check whether systems have been updated or needed to be replaced. And why would this be important? Well, connected to this risk was the fact that some of the firms we saw were using operating systems that were nearing the end of their lives and would no longer be supported by updates, risking compromise in the future. This is an area, of course, perhaps where a specific cyber budget would be helpful. Most of the firms that we saw used third-party IT professionals, and of course this is absolutely fine and it can provide valuable expertise and allow you to carry on with your business. However, the key message for you is that you can't also outsource your responsibility with your IT. You remain responsible for oversight of your own cybersecurity. This was shown probably most clearly by two firms who were exposed to successful cyber attacks as a result of failings by their IT providers. One, for example, discovered that their provider had not configured their system to prevent multiple password attempts. But of course, the firm hadn't tested their own procedures either. So this all leads to the point that cybersecurity isn't just an IT issue. It's a key part of all of your firm's usual risk management processes. And while you shouldn't wait for an attack to review your systems, you could use one as an opportunity to assess your systems and thereafter test them regularly. Finally, a key area for firms, and looking at in our report, were risks around people. That's clients and your staff. Most of the firms we met felt that their staff were their key weakness. But obviously, they should be your strongest asset and a key line of defence, which often only needs the investment of your time. This slide shows you some of the strategies that you could use to build your defences by implementing helpful behaviours which could make the difference when trying to mitigate harmful outcomes. Firstly, look on focusing on encouraging positive behaviours. Raise awareness of the risks rather than apportioning blame, and support staff when the worst happens. Start this culture by motivating staff to report concerns with incentives and perhaps even team targets. This is probably more likely to encourage staff to highlight risks to you, which of course is a key way of preventing them. Training should be regular and integrated into everyday routine activities. For example, as a matter of good practice, train people to verify the identity of senders. No expensive softwares are needed. Simply hover your mouse over an email address to reveal what's hiding beneath. Remember too that phishing attacks are also originated with clients, and so educate them as well about these key risks. Finally, looking at senior managers should have oversight of cybersecurity, and clear reporting lines can help build confidence in your procedures from the most senior to the most junior members at your firm. So hopefully you can see that people, yes, are a risk, but also a key line of defence. So again, just think for yourself a moment, think about your own firm. Have you got the balance right? So finally, we've talked about strategies to manage risks, and we obviously talked about the impact, but what do we expect from you? There are 3 key points to consider, I think. Firstly, even small firms hold high volumes of funds and therefore are attractive targets for fraudsters. Rule 6.1 of the account rules requires firms to immediately replace any money that's been improperly withdrawn from the client account. You should also report this loss to us, and we will engage with you constructively and proportionately. But don't wait for an attack, again, to test your security. Why not carry out an assessment of how safe your clients are this week? Are you equipped to protect clients when changes to bank instructions happen? Do you have strategies in place, such as requiring passwords, identification, or perhaps a verbal or written confirmation before transferring funds? Confirmation of the payee system does provide some further protection for us this year, but also think that firms still need to remain vigilant. You are responsible. Moving on to the standards and regulations, we expect firms to run their businesses on sound risk management and principles. You need to identify, monitor, and manage all material risks. This includes protecting clients' money, assets, and personal data. This is a business-critical issue for firms of all sizes. It can start with some basics, such as understanding your business, identifying key risk areas, learning from previous incidents, and planning how to manage for future threats. Target your focus initially in areas of the business where you think you might need it most, and prioritise, for example, storage facilities, malware defences, informed staff, and incident records. Courses like Cyber Essentials can demonstrate your commitment to protecting your staff and clients, and it's also a cost-effective way to mitigate some of the harm that we've talked about today. Know your reporting requirements. You should report any serious concerns promptly. Now, we know that the volume of attempted cybercrime attacks are far higher than the circa 150 that we receive every year. In fact, we found that only 70% of the firms that we visited had reported all successful cyber incidents to us. Now, our enforcement strategy sets out our expectation that firms report attacks even if there are no concerns about personal conduct or systems. So COPs should report a successful attack to us, even if client money was not taken and even if you've repaid the money. Also, while it's not a requirement, if you are subject to an attack that is particularly novel, sophisticated or interesting, please let us know, as it could help us to support other firms, for example with scam alerts. Remember too that firms should report any personal data breaches caused by cybersecurity incidents to the ICO within 72 hours of becoming aware of the breach. It may also be appropriate to report incidents to Action Fraud or the NCSC, depending on its seriousness. Finally, if you've been listening to this and are at the beginning of your cybersecurity journey and thinking, well, where do I start? Here are 5 first steps to help you on that road to improving your cybersecurity. Includes updating your knowledge, patching software, monitoring your defences, supporting and motivating staff, planning contingencies for future threats, and of course, as we've mentioned, having effective cyber management oversight. However, it's important for all firms to recognise and review cyber risks. We know both that small firms and large firms with sophisticated systems are successfully targeted by cybercrime. Take this opportunity to carry out a health check of your own systems, policies and procedures, and test and review them now and regularly. So, I'm afraid we've reached the end of this webinar, and I hope you found it helpful. But in a shameless plug, if you would like to learn more about our findings, please do read our thematic report. This, with some other resources and further reading, will also be available for you later today to download along with this webinar on demand. But for now, thank you for joining me, and if you have any comments or questions in the comments box, I will try and come back to you. Thank you.